Hi, I'm Lee Kelso, and this is HealthCall Live Online, the place for extended versions of interviews heard on our weekly radio broadcast, the HealthCall Live Radio Hour. So we talked before on the program about the importance of those millions, trillions of little travelers who go with us every place we go, our microbiome, the bacteria, virus, and fungi that live inside of us and have a big impact on how we think, how we feel, and in some cases, maybe even influence the diseases we suffer. Well, what about what happens with the foods that we eat? How does it affect them in a way that you might not have thought about? What are food preservatives doing to our microbiome? Well, let's talk with Dr. Sam Westreich. He is a bioinformatics scientist working not only in the field of microbiome, but some other industry interesting connections that we're going to talk about in a second. But Sam, what about that? What is there an impact? Should we be concerned about the food preservatives we eat and the impact it's having on our microbiome?
So we certainly should. One of the things that we have to remember as human beings is that we are not alone. We have trillions of microbes that live in our lower digestive tract, mainly in our small and large intestine. And they're not only passengers that ride along with us, they're active participants. They engage with us, and everything that we eat contributes to their diet. They get all their food from what we take in, and so by choosing what we choose to eat or don't eat, we actually affect that microbiome, and that in turn has a feedback loop that comes back on us. So thinking about things like preservatives in our diet, things like the types of nutrients that we're eating, that doesn't just matter for our own health, but it matters for the health of our microbiome of this diverse collection of bacteria, and those then influence us as well.
So we talked before on the program about how these microbiome elements process vitamins and make them available for our bodies to use, short-chain fatty acids, and a lot of other things that are helpful to us. So preservatives, the main function of a food preservative is to extend its shelf life. And that means in many cases it's trying to prevent the growth of bacteria. So I see the connection there. If I'm eating something that's designed to stop bacteria, really, what's that doing inside me?
That's right. That is exactly the issue that can come up with preservatives. When we eat preservatives, these are usually ingredients that are not chosen specifically because they have health benefits for us, but because that they ensure that food stays stable at room temperature, it doesn't break down on a shelf, you don't get changes in phase, you don't have your Twinkies all of a sudden start melting and turning into goop. And as you pointed out, it is often an antimicrobial. The compounds that we add to our food, we don't want them growing bacteria when they're sitting on the shelves. Those compounds make it through and go into our digestive system. And they won't wipe out your microbiome the same way that if you take an antibiotic carpet bombs the microbiome and will take out everything. When we eat foods that contain preservatives, what instead happens is our microbiome shifts. It is made up of lots of different species. In the average human microbiome, there's over 1,000 different species of bacteria that are all living there in an uneasy harmony. When we make changes by doing things like introducing more preservatives into our diet, that will push down on some species, and then other species will be able to grow more to sort of take over that new opportunity that's opened up. And that's not always good for us. What we find is a lot of times when these new species that thrive in a preservative-rich environment start taking over, they lead to some health issues with us. They can trigger increased inflammation, and they'll actually eat away at the mucus lining of our digestive tract, which can cause all sorts of problems for us.
Yeah, let's talk about that for just a quick second to explain that. So that mucus lining is really just kind of one cell layer thick on the inside of our intestines. And if then those bacteria can come in contact with our immune system, you can set up an awful reaction that creates a number of problems, right?
That's right. So our intestinal lining, the cells that make that lining, are constantly producing a layer of mucus, which it's kind of like the snot that's in our noses, where it's a little gross, but it's there for a protective effect. And normally, that mucus provides a very comfortable environment for the microbes that live in our digestive system to hang out in. They're able to stay inside that mucus, which comes in a couple different levels. So the first level that's on the innermost side is going to be thinner and more fluid, less dense. And then as you work your way closer to the cell wall, the edge of our intestine, that mucus gets thicker and thicker and more dense. And this is a great place for these bacteria to hang out. They eat some of the starches and some of the fiber and other compounds that pass through our diet, and they're able to be protective so they won't all be flushed away. And normally, that stays in harmony. Our cells constantly churn out more mucus. The bacteria stay in this mucus. Some of those bacteria will actually eat the mucus as a potential food source, but most of the time they're preferring to eat what comes through the intestine. They're eating the foods that we eat rather than eating away at us. But what happens is some bacteria do eat that mucus, and when those bacteria are present at high abundances, when those bacteria start taking over, they will eat away the mucus faster than our cells can produce it, and eventually they break through and they're butting right up against the wall of our intestinal tract. When that happens, as you mentioned, our immune system is in very close contact with our intestinal tract. Our immune cells actually extend feelers through, and they're checking to see what bacteria are there. Our immune system actually uses our gut microbiome as a constant sort of validating ground. It's always checking to see which bacteria are present in the gut, and it's believed that the immune system actually uses normal gut bacteria as a way to modulate and understand how much of a reaction it should be putting up. Should it be flaring up and causing inflammation because it thinks there's an invasion, or should it be staying calm and at a very low level of activity? When the bacteria eat away at too much of the mucus and they're butting right up against the wall of our intestine, what happens then is that they hit all of those immune sensors, and our immune system starts overreacting and saying, oh my God, these bacteria are breaking through, and it'll flare up, and that's where we get inflammation, colitis, and other problems that can come and can be associated with gut issues.
Yeah, think of them as nasty little bacteria attacking the wall of the castle, right? I like simple images.
They're okay. Yeah, normally they're okay. We're still producing mucus at a regular rate, and so a lot of the bacteria that are mucus eaters are not necessarily bad bacteria. These guys are not just in there to try and get all the way into our cell wall and cause all sorts of problems. A lot of the bacteria that are normally present in our gut have multiple different systems for picking out food sources. If their preferred food is available, usually that's something that we eat, like starch or fiber, they'll feast on that. They're very happy to feast on that. But if you take away that food source, if there isn't enough fiber, if there isn't enough fermented products, not enough prebiotic meals coming down the pipe, then they'll switch over to eating the mucus as a backup method. And so it's not always going to be that we can separate these into good bacteria and bad bacteria. Instead, it's the same bacteria which can take either good or bad actions depending upon the signals that they get from their environment.
Got it. So we, typically want to think about eating foods with the smallest amount of preservative is going to be best for us, right? Closer to nature, the better you are. But there are so many foods today that we don't think about as having preservatives because they're in the form of an emulsifier. Can you walk me through that and help me understand what that means?
Sure. So emulsifiers are compounds that are designed to help, again, keep our food stable. If you think about something like a liquid that you might keep on a shelf, you really don't want that liquid to solidify, and you don't want it to separate. And so that's where emulsifiers come in. And so these are great ingredients if you're looking to preserve your food because they help keep that balance and they help sort of suspend everything in a kind of mix. And that, again, that's great for stabilizing. That is not super great for our microbiome. There's a lot of foods, like if you think about mayonnaise, where it's kind of liquidy, but it stays in that sort of soft, semi-liquid state, and you can leave mayonnaise on the store at the grocery store for weeks and it's still fine. You think about pasta sauces, where they stay that nice creamy liquid when you grab them at the grocery store. You think about certain types of peanut butter, where it's always going to be smooth and spreadable no matter how long it's been sitting. Then if you think about ice cream, where ice cream can sometimes sit out a surprising amount of time without actually fully melting. The way all of those foods are able to remain stable is through this addition of emulsifiers. And so these are something where there have actually been studies that have said, what happens if we feed high levels of emulsifiers to example experimental species that replicate our human gut microbiome? And what we see, again, is that colitis. We see the inflammation that happens in the bowel because the bacteria are the emulsifiers are encouraging the growth of bacteria that feast on mucus rather than feasting on fiber and other ingredients that are coming through the diet. And that leads to irritation as those bacteria eat through that mucus layer and get up against the gut wall.
So is there a solution here other than trying to just minimize exposure to foods that are shelf stable?
I mean, I don't think there is a permanent solution in that there's no pill that you can take that will magically mitigate the effects of eating preservatives. And I don't think we're going to get preservatives entirely out of our lives, even though dietitians, doctors are always encouraging folks to eat healthy. I still enjoy a cup of ice cream after a nice dinner. I don't think we're ever going to be able to fully give up all of our processed foods. Instead, what we can do is we can try and minimize the ratio of emulsified foods that we eat in our diet, try and make sure that along with maybe having some foods that have some preservatives in it, we also provide plenty of other foods that do contain some of the natural food sources of these microbes. Like I mentioned, these microbes have multiple different pathways for picking out their food, and they all have their preferred food. If you give them their preferred food, they might not eat away at the mucus layer because they've got their preferred food that's able to provide all their needs. So what we can do is we can say, okay, maybe I am still going to have some mayonnaise on my sandwich, but I'm also going to then make sure I have a side salad. I get a good source of fiber. I get maybe some good prebiotics, something that's been fermented a little bit, that will be able to provide a primary food source for these bacteria so they don't switch over to their alternate pathway of mucus eating.
Yeah, so once again, if you think about how maybe your great grandmother would have eaten and stayed closer to her diet, yeah, that's probably, we call that the Edna diet around here. Try to stay closer, and that's something that there's more and more research on, are foods that our ancestors just never had access to because they weren't created yet. And one of those are processed seed oils. There's a lot of concern now about, are these things creating an issue? Can you help us understand what that challenge might be?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So seed oils, I think, is interesting because when we're talking about oils, what we're really talking about is fat. Oils are just liquid fats, and the idea is that fat comes in a few different types. So really briefly, we have, you've probably seen these on nutrition facts and nutrition labels. We have unsaturated fats, we have monounsaturated fats, we have polyunsaturated fats, and we have trans fats. These are sort of the four main categories. And the names are really complex, but if you think about each fat as just a long chain of carbons, that's all that fats really are. It's a long chain of carbons with a head at one end. So really, when we're talking about seed oils versus, for example, beef tallow or butter or avocado oil or olive oil, what we're really talking about when we look deep at the food is the different types of fats, these four types of fats. And what's come up, I think, in recent years is the idea that some of these fats are associated with things that aren't good with us. And because of that, there's actually been a backlash against the oil itself.
Yeah, I've read that the category that these fall into, according to some activists, is they're not evolutionarily compatible with our systems. So if you are artificially creating these oils by hydrogenating them, we don't really know what impact that is going to have on our bodies. Do you think that's anything I ought to be concerned about?
So I think that's an interesting statement because it's partially true and it's partially false. Some of the seed oils that we take, like, yes, we probably would not have encountered this at that level 10,000 years ago, but we also didn't encounter things like citrus 10,000 years ago. There's a lot of foods that we eat. Practically everything in our diet these days is something that our ancestors didn't encounter. So that throwback and saying these aren't natural and therefore they're bad is, I think, a false conclusion. It's kind of an appeal to nature. And a contrast that you might point out if somebody brings that up is to point out the fact that, 10,000 years ago, our ancestors were out in the sun, they ate all natural foods, and they died at the age of 35. Maybe that's not necessarily the path we want to be going down. But I do think what we do need to consider is that, yes, some of the fats that are especially processed are not good for us. Trans fats in particular tend to be quite bad for us, and those are the ones that you find most commonly in foods that we know are unhealthy. If we talk about something like a Twinkie, which is my favorite example to go to just because we all know about it, that little yellow cake that's surprisingly shelf stable. So that cake, the way that they put oil in that cake in order to make sure that the cake does not break down is they hydrogenate it. Basically, they make it so that oil will stay as a solid at room temperature. And hydrogenated oils have been shown to be associated with greater risk of heart attacks, higher blood pressure, and other issues. But we shouldn't lump all of the seed oils, so to say, into this category. There's a lot of seed oils, if you think about canola, peanut, sunflower, safflower oils. These oils are mostly monounsaturated fats, and they're actually shown to be correlated with a lower risk of heart disease, lower levels of inflammation. So a lot of the accusations, they may have targeted some fats that are bad for us, but there have also been some more innocent fats, let's say, that have been caught in the crossfire.
Yeah, I get it. So I love to ask people like you who've studied this stuff and understand it far better than I, with everything you've learned and what you know, how do you manage life maybe a little differently than I might? What are some habits you've adopted with the information that you've gathered?
I'd say one of the things that I've found is that a lot of fads and a lot of new trends in health still come back to what we know. And it is the unsexy truth, but a lot of our dietary choices are the obvious choices. Michael Pollan has this great quote where he says, "Eat real food, not too much, mostly plants." And that's been a thing that we have stuck to for thousands of years. And if you want to consider what our ancestors did, if you want to look back, our ancestors, they didn't eat meat at every meal. At least most of them didn't. If you're talking about certain tribes, perhaps, but most of our ancestors, they mainly ate plants, they ate berries, they ate primarily raw foods. They didn't do a lot of real processing and breaking down foods, and they ate a lot more fiber than what we tend to get in our diet today. And so what I've tried to do in my own diet, what I see as the best approach is, first off, I don't hold myself to a super strict standard. I don't say no processed foods ever. Trying to stick to some diet like that for our entire lives is going to be a recipe for disaster. On the other hand, what we can do is we can say, I'm going to try and make sure that I eat mostly plants in my diet. I'm going to try and not have meat all the time. I don't need meat at every meal. And I'm going to try and just minimize the amount of processed stuff that I take in. And this overall tends to be a pretty good strategy. I think a lot of us, when we go to the store, we're able to look around and we can say, if I get a salad, that's going to be healthier for me than if I go and get some French fries and some chicken nuggets. We know this, and sticking to those sort of common sense choices is really going to be the thing that makes the biggest impact for most of us. There are a few people out there who I know are going to be at the pinnacle of health, and they're going to care about doing things like optimizing your level of omega-3 versus omega-6 fats. These are super specific categories of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fat, and people may say, I want to make sure that these are balanced. Most of us are not going to be at that level of optimizing our health. If you look around at your diet, if you think back to what you ate for the last week, if you had any white bread in there, if you maybe grabbed a donut for breakfast, if you decided that you did a really good job one night and so you're rewarding yourself after dinner with a glass of ice cream, maybe you notice that you've been having a few sugary sodas. If that's the case, at that level where most of us are, we don't really need to worry about optimizing our nutrition all the way down to that micro level. Instead, there are some pretty clear common sense choices that we can make. Overall, we want to try and not overeat. We want to try and use less processed ingredients. We want to try and mainly focus on plants. And we want to try and stay away from foods that contain a lot of preservatives or have gone through a lot of modification in order to make them shelf stable, which tends to strip out a lot of the nutritional value for us.
I love that common sense message. I think it's so important. I've shared with the audience before, Sam, that what I have learned in talking to people over all these years is the single most important thing you can do is control what you put in your mouth and how much exercise you get. The genes, you can't do much about. Those two factors you can, and you just confirmed that making good choices is the right path. Appreciate that. That's Dr. Sam Westreich. Well, yes, sir.
Yeah, one more comment, just speaking from my microbiome pedestal. If I was to recommend any single dietary choice to folks, overall, the answer is going to be fiber. One of the things that I think we minimize too much in our society, we love to have foods that have been broken down, that have been softened, that have been reduced for us, which is great because those foods are delicious. But If somebody out there is looking for one single choice that they can make to say, I want to improve my diet with this one choice, I'm already, I'm watching out for processed foods, I'm already trying to do decently, but I still would like to do one thing to improve, it would be look to add more sources of dietary fiber. Again, our microbes, they eat what we take in, but their favorite food to feast upon is fiber. This comes up in many different sources. You can look for resistant starch, which is in the skins of potatoes, which is in nuts, which is in beans. You can look for other types of fiber, like cellulose, which you'll find whenever you eat plants. That's one of the reasons why salads are so great, along with vitamins and being low calorie. They also have a lot of fiber. Our ancestors, about 10,000 years ago, ate more than double the amount of fiber that we eat today. So if I was going to recommend one dietary change for the audience, think about your fiber intake and see if when you're going for a snack, maybe grab something that has a bit more fiber and your microbes will thank you.
Hey, you know what? I would love to have you back next month, and let's do a deeper dive on fiber. Walk us through what fibers our microbiome likes, what's phony, and how we might be able to eat more fiber with less bloating and discomfort that some people have. How's that sound?
Lee, I would love to talk about fiber. I could talk about fiber for an hour.
All right, I appreciate that. We'll do that maybe next month. Thanks very much. Sam Westreich, appreciate your time.
Thank you.